All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive into some of the biggest stories happening around the world right now. I mean, things are really popping off,
Yeah,
and there's just so much to talk about.
there is.
We've got Somalia, Japan, Ukraine, Russia, the U.S., and India,
Wow.
all on the docket today.
That's quite the world tour.
It is. And I think we're going to find some really fascinating
Yeah,
connections between these seemingly totally unrelated events.
I'm sure we will.
So let's just dive right in and start
Uh-huh.
with Somalia.
Okay.
So former President Trump just authorized airstrikes against ISIS in Somalia, and it just seems like every U.S. president
Mm.
ends up having to deal with Somalia in some way. Why is this place such a consistent problem for American foreign policy?
Well, the U.S. has a long and complicated history in Somalia. We've had interventions there in the past, some with, some pretty tragic outcomes.
Right.
And it makes any kind of involvement really sensitive. This latest move by Trump, it definitely raises the stakes.
Yeah, for sure. Especially with this quote, we will find you and we will kill you. I mean,
Yeah.
talk about some strong words.
That's very strong rhetoric.
Who's he even talking to there?
Well, it's definitely a message aimed at multiple audiences. On the one hand, it's meant to reassure Americans that, their government is taking a hard line against terrorism. But on the global stage, it sends a very clear warning to groups like ISIS. The question is, does this kind of rhetoric actually deter terrorism, or could it backfire and fuel further radicalization?
Yeah, it's a really tough question to answer. Okay, well, let's completely shift gears here.
Okay.
We've got this story about an 81-year-old woman in Japan who keeps getting arrested
Mhm.
for petty crimes
Yeah.
just so she can stay in prison.
Really?
Yeah, it's wild. What's going on there?
Well, it's actually quite sad. This case really highlights the struggles that so many elderly people face in Japan. The pension system is strained, living costs are high, and there's a lot of societal pressure on older folks. For those without a strong family support system, it can be a desperate situation.
Yeah, and her son actually wanted her to leave prison, which just adds this whole
Oh.
other layer of complexity to this whole thing.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder if this is like a uniquely Japanese problem, or if this is something that other countries with aging populations are going to have to face.
It's definitely a global challenge. Japan's situation is unique, but a lot of developed nations are dealing with aging populations
Hmm.
and trying to figure out how to provide adequate social safety nets. It's a tough balancing act.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, speaking of complex situations, let's talk about Ukraine.
All right.
So there are reports that North Korean troops who have been fighting alongside Russia are being pulled back from the front lines.
Hmm.
What was North Korea even doing there in the first place?
Yeah, it is kind of a head scratcher. Their involvement most likely comes down to a need for cash and a desire to strengthen their ties with Russia, especially with China, already a major player in the region. Sending troops is a risky move, though, especially with reports of 4,000 casualties.
4,000 casualties. That's a huge number. Can we even trust those reports, though, given how secretive North Korea is?
That's the million-dollar question. Information coming out of North Korea is notoriously difficult to verify. It's a good reminder that we always have to be critical of the information that we're getting, especially in situations like this.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go back to the U.S. and Ukraine.
Okay.
The U.S. is pushing for Ukraine to hold elections by the end of the year,
Mm-hmm.
if there's a ceasefire with Russia. But is it even possible to have legitimate elections in a country that's literally at war?
That's the big question. How do you ensure free and fair elections when parts of the country are under occupation, millions of people are displaced, basic security is a challenge? And then there's the political angle. Is the U.S. push truly about promoting democracy in Ukraine, or is there some kind of strategic calculation tied to the conflict with Russia?
Right, especially with Trump planning to meet with Putin soon. I mean, that meeting could really shake things up.
Absolutely. That meeting will have huge implications for the future of the conflict, and the whole world will be watching.
Yeah. Okay, our last stop takes us to India,
Okay.
where there's been a major development.
Yeah.
In the case of Rana, who was accused in the 2008 Mumbai attacks.
Oh, right.
Those attacks were just horrific.
They were.
And they really strained relations between India and Pakistan.
Absolutely. The attacks killed over 160 people, and they were a major turning point. Rana was a Pakistani-Canadian businessman, and he was convicted for his role in providing material support to the terrorists.
And now, after the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal, he's run out of legal options. India and the U.S. are working on extraditing him back to India to face charges. What happens next?
Well, extradition's a complicated process. It involves a lot of legal back and forth between countries. But in this case, since Rana's appeals have been exhausted, it's highly likely that he'll be sent back to India to stand trial.
It's hard to imagine what closure even looks like
Hmm.
for the victims' families after something so horrific. But hopefully this brings them at least some sense of justice.
Yeah, it's a small step in a very long healing process.
Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From Somalia to Japan to Ukraine to India. It's amazing how interconnected these events really are.
What's fascinating to me is how seemingly isolated incidents can reveal these larger global patterns. Whether it's the challenges of aging populations, the complexities of international relations, or the ripple effects of conflict, it's all connected.
Yeah, it definitely makes you realize that the news isn't just a bunch of random headlines. It's a snapshot of a world that's constantly in motion.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that we always have to be digging deeper, questioning what we hear and making those connections for ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.